Elizabeth Hinton, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies and Professor of Law at Yale University, and author of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, and most recently, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. And along with Brian Simon, I served as co-chair of the in-person UHA conference in Detroit that never was due to COVID. And so this online event is what we landed on. But here we are gathered together from across the country and the world. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to the State of the American City, Problems and Possibilities, which is the first of 3 plenaries taking place during the Urban History Association's Urban History Month. This event's plenary brings together some of the nation's and the UHA's leading scholars of the city, scholars, public intellectuals, and activists who have been pushing at the boundaries of what it means to do urban history as they have researched and written about modern American cities of the 20th and 21st centuries. The voices you hear tonight give you just a taste of the extraordinary, vibrant organization the UHA is today, and from them, I suspect you will hear a million reasons why it is so essential that historians are front and center, not just when understanding cities of the past, but also in the right now. This is, in fact, the topic we have asked each of the panelists to speak on, the state of the American city right now, and what this might suggest for us as urban historians and for the field of urban history. So before we begin, please be aware that this event is being recorded. The panelists are just going to offer up a set of thoughts on this topic, on these questions, and I will introduce each one of them. They will speak, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Please, if a question comes to you as a panelist is speaking, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll have a good, vibrant discussion for at least about 40 minutes or so. So first, we're going to hear from Destin Jenkins, who is an assistant professor of history at Stanford University. Destin is the author of Bonds of Inequality, Debt, and the Making of the American City, which was published by University of Chicago Press in 2021. He is also the principal investigator and curator of The Business of Debt, a digital humanities project that reveals how the 20th century municipal bond market was not driven by abstract processes, but stitched together by a small but powerful cadre of financiers and attorneys. Finally, he is co-editor of Histories of Racial Capitalism, which came out with Columbia University Press in 2021, which brings together scholars across a range of disciplines to revisit the persistent question of the relationship between race and capitalism. Destin, hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Really good to be here with you all today. I'm here on the West Coast, so it's 4 o'clock my time, 7 o'clock your time, maybe, or wherever else you are. Thank you for being here. I want to reflect a little bit on the kind of 2 parts of the question, the state of American cities today and the role of the urban historian. I'll probably have less to say about the state of the field. And I want to do so as a scholar with research interest in the history of race, African Americans, cities and finance, but also as someone with an intellectual and set of political commitments to social movements. So wearing kind of 2 hats, if you will. I don't want to spend too much time on the problems, right, facing American cities, in part because others have described the problems, the innumerable problems, far better than I ever can. And besides, to quote the great Toni Morrison, quote, language can never pin down slavery, genocide, or war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so, end quote. And so if it is true that American cities and suburbs are marked by ongoing wars against Black and Indigenous communities, if inequality is an assault on the common good, then no description of the problems of American cities will ever suffice. So instead, what I want to do is reflect a little bit first on what gives me hope to ultimately kind of transition to a set of dilemmas I think are before us. The first thing that gives me hope are the movements. I remain inspired and forever changed by the movement for Black lives. As a member of BYP 100 some time ago in New York City, that's changed my outlook in so many different ways. Intrigued by local and international organizing against privatization and attempts to break the reliance on the private sector for delivery and management of public infrastructure and services, otherwise known as remunicipalism. I have learned a great deal from the political analysis of organizers in cities around the country, whether it be through their discussion of how debt and money works, or their systemic institutional critique of racism, neighborhood change, and inequality more broadly. And I'm thrilled as a geek, I suppose, when I see examples of forensic accounting around corporate and state finance, with the upshot being folks able to follow the money to disrupt otherwise racist narratives of fiscal crises and so forth. And yet, this movement, energy, political analysis, and forensic accounting has not, to my mind, translated into real power. Agency, to be sure, resistance without question, but power as in the ability to shape the choices of others and to escape the constraints placed upon the most marginalized and even those with some resources, well, not so much. And so I see this, this is where my own research background comes into play. I see this as in part a function of American federalism and financial power. With some exceptions, revenue generating powers, especially via taxation, remain lodged at the state level. And so local movements may compel tax-exempt universities to deliver, for instance, payments in lieu of taxes to the cities of which they are a part, but the real power to commandeer fiscal resources along progressive lines is often out of reach. And then, of course, there's the challenge of finance. And this challenge is enormous and is rooted in no small part in the structural dependence of American cities on financiers for their most basic services. The bondholder's veto, as Brian Highsmith has recently described it. Indeed, it is difficult to escape the penalties of the financial world when revenue targets are missed, or even in anticipation that a revenue target may be missed. So basically, in the United States, as I see it, we have the challenge of the outsized power of finance over American cities, and the challenge of American federalism, which, as I'm trying to process this, is at once structural in the sense of the challenge is how to access the arena in which the levers of state fiscal powers are located. And also in terms of custom and social, though at the same time, I can't quite tell if ours is still a moment in which the older, quote, deference to localism built into most liberal social programs during the mid-20th century that Tom Segura once described is still a dynamic, or if cities are pinched by the pull toward an imperial presidency, aristocratic courts, and anti-democratic Senate. So as of late, I've been grappling with a pretty heavy question, and this is really a question that I've been forced to engage is talking to people about my book, The Bonds of Inequality, talking to people in the finance world, people who want to do something about climate change, et cetera. And the question is this, which I'd like to present to you all, what to do about these dual challenges in the face of climate breakdown and ecological destruction. If, quote, we're not yet ready for what's already happened, to quote Alex Steffen. And if we can agree that the mobilization of resources through financial markets happens much faster than legislative executive action, to say nothing of the actual distribution of grants or even zero interest loans into the hands of the people and communities, then what should be the left's position? Is it an acceptable trade-off, I guess, to leverage financial markets to deliver protective infrastructure in the face of climate change, even if in so doing we deepen the power of finance? So I began my book project trying to undermine the power of finance. At the same time, I'm forced with this to grapple with this question of how to actually deliver critical infrastructure to communities that are very vulnerable, in which we see, whether it be in places like Alabama, Texas, elsewhere, reactionary governance, which would otherwise kind of tighten the movement, if you will, even if we were to be able to secure federal grants and loans and allocate that to communities. So as we think about the future of American cities, a precarious future of rising sea levels, failing infrastructure, and much more, what are the acceptable trade-offs? And so this is me as sort of the thinker, the researcher who understands bond finance, et cetera, but also very much interested in the public policy implications of that, and also in terms of movements. The question of whether to be a purist or whether to compromise. What are the trade-offs, again, when you have the power of finance and yet the very real threats around climate and ecological destruction? The short answer is I don't have an answer, as you might have guessed, but it is a big question. And I think it's important for us to consider the relation, or as we consider the relationship between environmental, fiscal, social, political, and economic problems facing American cities and their residents. This is a dilemma that progressive forces in American cities must confront. So what then, given that dilemma, is the role of the urban historian? In my opinion, the best urban histories are those that are attentive to place and institutions. Not the best, but some of my favorite urban histories, I should say, written by many people on this call or on the video here. So to my mind, I think urban historians are well place to locate the pressure points within institutions, that is, as they exist within the levels of public power, federal, state, and local government, and within the existing financial architecture. Pressure points on which movements of today and tomorrow might push. And in my opinion, the upshot should not be simply to disclose or explain how we got here. To me, I think the role of the urban historian should be to communicate these identifiable pressure points before different audiences, and to also interpret these accounts across different medium, be it podcasts, Twitter threads, video essays, or otherwise. Urban historians need not be activists, but we should help sharpen the analysis of our most dedicated freedom dreamers and be transformed by the process of genuine exchange. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dustin. We're all clapping. If we were together in a conference room, you'd hear it. Okay, so next we're going to move to Professor Benjamin Holtzman, who is Assistant Professor of History at Lehman College, CUNY. His research focuses on politics, cities, race and inequality, political economy, labor, and social movements. And he is the author of The Long Crisis, New York City and the Path to Neoliberalism, which was published this year by Oxford University Press. And you can also find his writings in the Washington Post, Shelter Force, Jacobin, and Modern American History.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. And thanks to everybody who at the UHA, all the program organizers and everyone who put their time and labor into making this event happen. I'm really also thrilled to be speaking along these panelists whose work I'm in total admiration of. So this is a tremendous privilege. I'm grateful for Dustin sort of starting us off by thinking about the kind of state of cities today, because I think that's actually the more exciting part of this conversation. I'm tilting a bit more towards the field, but I'm excited for us to sort of be thinking collectively and about that question that he has so astutely started us off towards. So yeah, so I just wanted to begin by noting a few of the really kind of more exciting, or some of the exciting areas in recent US urban history, and then talk a bit about what I think is just one of the numerous realms for productive research. So, you know, I think this is a really fascinating and wonderful time in urban history. We have scholars who are thinking about immigrant and second generation communities, and historians who are covering the vibrant lives of queer and trans folks, scholars going beyond national borders of cities through transnational frameworks. And for my own teaching and writing, I found much of the most illuminating work to come from scholars who are continuing to think critically about race, capitalism, and inequality, building on a wealth of earlier scholarship, notable recent work in the field by my fellow panelists like Kiangi Mata-Taylor and Dustin, and scholars like Paige Klotzer, Ben Chansfield, among many, many others, have really astutely parsed out the ways in which metropolitan landscapes have been constructed and reconstructed along deeply inequitable lines. By recovering the roles of the private sector, federal, state, and local policymakers, courts, and community members, this work has continued to illustrate how racial and class inequalities have been endemic to the state history and current state of metropolitan America. And I would also include as part of this literature the really vibrant histories on policing and incarceration, institutions which, as scholars and activists have shown, have been among the most powerful of all instruments that maintain inequities under racial capitalism. So much really rich and insightful history here that I hope I'll echo the call, of course, that this continues to make it into the classrooms and the public realms through various ways where it can really make an impact. But I also want to point to just one area that historians, especially those thinking about urban inequality, could bring even more of their insight to. And that's to the movements and people who were trying to change racial and class inequities and injustice. I think this work is especially needed on cities after the 1960s and into the 21st century, but this applies to earlier periods as well. And by this, I don't just mean formal social movements, but various terrains of struggle, from spontaneous protests to policy campaigns that challenged inequalities, if not racial capitalism more generally. I don't think this is a particularly controversial statement, I'll admit, but I nonetheless want to note some reasons why histories are of resistance are important. I think maybe especially so at this time. So this history, of course, reminds us and various audiences that the construction and maintenance of racial capitalism was consistently challenged. An insight that is obvious, but one I don't think should be taken for granted, as well as how people and movements succeeded in transforming policies, practices, and instruments of racial capitalism. But as people who have long written on movements have made clear, this history can generate revealing questions even when struggle was not entirely successful. For instance, what cracks did people create that future organizers could exploit and widen? How did organizing experiences at one moment inspire and educate participants in subsequent waves of struggle? Alternatively, what opposition did people face and what did those reveal about racial capitalism? What did movements miss? Were there ways efforts inadvertently empowered instruments of capitalism? Continuing to exhume the barriers communities and movements butted up against can reveal just as much about the mechanisms of racial capitalism as focusing on its proponents. I think this work also helps to center those who have faced the brunt of capitalism, people of color, low-income people, women, queer and trans folks in this history. Finally, without this kind of work, or without focus enough on this kind of work on resistance and opposition, the history of metropolitan racial and economic inequity and racial capitalism more generally risks being seen by students and the public as so entrenched and so immutable, so as to be inalterable in our present and futures. To be sure, this work has and is, of course, being done by many, many people, including excellent recent work by historians like Rebecca Marshall on challenges to redline, our host, Elizabeth Hinton, on rebellions against police violence and poverty, and in really exciting research by newer scholars like Eddie Bonilla, Solani Bahaman, Minju Bay, and others. And I hope we can support it and see more of it. And I think there are especially rich opportunities to analyze the processes that perpetuated racial and economic inequities alongside the people and movements that were trying to challenge them, to really think about these as operating in relationship with one another. And of course, more than a scholarly contribution, this work can also speak to the problems and possibilities for cities today. Of course, one potent tool for addressing today's inequities is through the lessons that can be derived from past struggle. These lessons of strategies, innovations, missteps, and shortcomings can't simply be transported and applied to the present. It doesn't work like that, but they have value for exposing, uprooting, and transforming inequities. And there's also, of course, lots of many examples that we're familiar with of folks targeting injustice today who have in part gained from looking to past struggle, including from some work that's being done outside of the academy, like those organizers challenging white nationalists, learning from militant research produced by folks like Hillary Moore and James Tracy's work on historical anti-racist movements. So that's the main thing I wanted to say. I just wanted to also switch gears slightly and finish with one last thing. Again, kind of thinking state of the field in that part of the prompt, which is to give a quick shout out to the people who have been at the front lines and otherwise contributed to a current struggle that's relevant to this conversation. And that's the threat to academic labor and higher education. As we take stock of the field of urban history, we of course do so as people face a severely battered academic job market that not only affects the kind of work young scholars may feel they can pursue, but that has left many terrific people precariously employed, underemployed, or unemployed. And I don't think it's too alarmist to say that improving these conditions is critical to ensuring that there continues to be vibrant fields, especially that are coming from non-elite public institutions. So tremendous respect to those who are trying to address these issues on individual campuses, regional networks, and national initiatives like Higher Ed Labor United, and supporting measures like the College for All Act, which would make public colleges tuition free and greatly increase the percentage of tenure track positions for contingent faculty, and new scholars. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Benjamin. Okay, next we will hear from Kienga Yamada-Taylor, who is professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is a scholar of anti-Black racism, housing policy and real estate, radical politics and social movement. And her book, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2020. And as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, Professor Taylor was the recipient of a 2021 MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. We're so proud, so thrilled, so well-deserved. She really needs no introduction. And on top of all of that, she's also a contributing writer at The New Yorker. Kienga, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. I obviously do a lot of different kind of work, but I always tell people that my home is with the urban historians. So I'm super happy to be on this panel and to be with all of you tonight. So I'm gonna. I don't know if this is right. I have a bunch of questions and things I'm going to talk about, and for 8 minutes, and hopefully this will make some sense. One thing that occurred to me repeatedly while writing my book, Race for Profit, is how much we don't understand about the post-civil rights era. So really, from the 70s forward as historians. While much has been written to frame the late 1970s, the 1980s and the 1990s. So really looking at how this, the fallout from the 60s and the early 70s frame what comes after. Little of it has been historicized, what comes after. I don't know why this is, if it's perceived as being too close to the present, to understand accurately or clearly what we are seeing, but it is something that desperately needs to change. Because the consequence is that when we see the upheavals of today, aside from the catalyzing event, the police shooting, the pandemic, whatever it is, as a society, we are bereft of the historical and analytical tools to understand the underlying historical reasons or explanations for the depth of bitterness, whether it be on the left or the right, the anger and acrimony that pervade our society. So even before the outbreaks of historical levels of protest in 2020, these kinds of questions occurred to me when reading a range of Black memoirs over the last couple of years. And one of the things that struck me is how little we know about the conditions or circumstances that the first generation of Black Americans born in the post-civil rights era came of age in. So for me, my own life experience as someone who grew up in the 1980s, reading Kiese Lehman's Heavy, Jesmyn Ward's Men We Reaped, or even Patrisse Cullors' When They Call You a Terrorist, all of which provide important and intimate portrayals of Black life in the 1980s and 1990s, but whose profundity would be more closely understood with a broader and general understanding of the political, economic, and social transformations that took place in the 1980s and beyond. Of course, in some sense, the omissions I'm pointing to are overstated. Certainly the historical work on prisons, incarceration, and policing, and more generally, the turn to punishment in the 1970s has been a gateway to examine the changes in African-American life in the post-civil rights era. There is important pending work on the war on drugs, Donna Murch in particular, which will plunge us directly into these questions concerning Black life during this period. Elizabeth Hinton's book, America on Fire, began to address some of these questions directly, particularly with her chapter on the Miami Rebellion in the 1980s that masterfully demonstrates continuity with the previous period, while also introducing important caveats, ruptures, breaches with the past, imposing new questions in the process. Among social scientists, there have been an array of new questions concerning the movement of Black people out of the urban core into suburban enclaves, as some whites move further away and others return to reclaim urban centers. But what do we understand about this transition from urban concentration that was highlighted by both conservatives and liberals as a root problem in the devolution of American urban life to this period now when most Black people live in suburban areas? What happened? How did it happen? What precipitated these transformations? We know that Nixon and Reagan helped generate hysteria about the growth of the welfare state in the 1970s, including the demonization, or particularly the demonization of Black women as the undeserving face of welfare. But what were the implications of these politics in real life when the US entered into recession in the early 1980s and Black unemployment reached a historic high of 21% in 1982? How did the political conceptions and characterizations of poor and working class Black people as an underclass impact city politics where Black people at the time were concentrated? To that end, how do we understand the impacts and effects of Reaganism on urban life in general, but Black urban life in particular? Do we read this as a prehistory to the phenomenon of the reverse migration that is underway now? Of course, the 1980s are hardly just a story about poverty and inequality in Black life. It is also an extended moment of the growth of a Black political class, a small Black elite, where the political and economic cleavages in Black communities began to rise to the surface, no longer muted by the mutual strangulation of racial and residential segregation. How are Black women situated in this narrative? And how do the changing class dynamics in Black America affect the outcomes for Black women? How do we understand the transformation of Black feminism as a political framing that arises out of the activism of marginalized Black women activists, but whose politics and social analyses are drawn from the experiences of Black urban women? How do these shifts from grassroots organizing to an academic form of social inquiry and criticism, what happens in that transformation? What shifts in political economy facilitated that type of change? How do we historicize, not just chastise, these developments? What do they look like on the ground? How do we understand the simultaneous occurrence of deepening Black economic inequality and demonization through the public attacks on welfare, teenage pregnancy, and the war on drugs, while at the same time, the most popular people in the United States are Black, including Michael Jackson, Oprah Winfrey, Bill Cosby, Michael Jordan, Carl Lewis, Eddie Murphy, to just name a few. These narrowly defined success stories confirmed for some that the United States had indeed turned the corner in its ugly history regarding the subjugation of African Americans and legitimized the political discourse of colorblindness. How does this also overlap with the deepening of Black political power, not only within the Congressional Black Caucus, but evidenced through the successes of Harold Washington in his run for mayor, and Jesse Jackson's presidential runs in 1984 and 1988? These are questions that political scientists and sociologists have tangled with for years, but for whom historians continue to lag behind. More consequentially, the new emblems of Black success in politics and beyond help to articulate, again, this new narrative of colorblindness while simultaneously deploying either racial stereotypes or racial silence to explain the persistence of poverty and marginalization among poor and working class Black people, reinforcing the belief that systemic racism was no longer a defining feature of American society. This racial camouflage obscured the reality of continuing color conscious governing embodied in the relentless attacks on the social welfare state, the war on drugs, and the changing political economy of the United States through the 1980s that disadvantaged the already fragile economic state of Black communities. These are only some of the questions that arise from the post-civil rights, within the post-civil rights era, but that are in desperate need of engagement if we are to understand the more recent roots of our contemporary crises. How do we understand the longer historical explanations for the rise of Black Lives Matter, the ill preparedness for an historic pandemic, the reasonings for the stunning ineptness of the Democratic Party, and the changing demography and class composition of our cities. We have to stop ceding this territory to social scientists in fear of presentism disrupting our work, and begin to engage in these recent historical questions that dictate and underlie so much of the contemporary world that we live in. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Kinga. Amen. Okay, let me just remind everyone to please use the Q&A function at any time when our panelists are speaking and something moves you. And we will have plenty of time for a really robust discussion already from these incredibly engaging sets of remarks. So moving forward, we're going to hear next from Lana Barber, who is Associate Professor of American Studies at State University of New York College at Old Westbury. Her first book, Latino City, Immigration and Urban Crisis in Lawrence, Massachusetts, 1945 to 2000, explored the history of New England's first Latinx majority city with a focus on the Puerto Rican and Dominican activism that transformed it. She is currently researching the militarized exclusion of Haitian migrants from the United States, the Dominican Republic, and the Bahamas in the late 20th century. So maybe speaking to some of what Kinga just lets us off with. Lana, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be on such an outstanding panel. So I'm really pleased to be here. As you just heard, I study immigration and Latinx history with a focus on the Caribbean diaspora and a focus on the way that anti-Black racism shapes migrant experiences. But I'm going to try to keep my urban hat on for the night and not veer too far abroad. Well, no, that's a lie. I'm definitely going to veer very far abroad, but I'll tie it back to cities, I promise. So what I want to argue tonight is that in order to understand the state of American cities, we need to reckon with the history of US imperialism. Contemporary US urbanism has been shaped in profound ways by military violence and imperial interventions abroad. Building on the settler colonialism at this nation's core, which is still ongoing, we can't say enough, the United States exerted power across the globe in the 20th and 21st centuries, including, as I'm sure many of us know, but it's worth saying one more time, just in case anyone doesn't, brutal military invasions and occupations overseas, CIA orchestrated coups against foreign leaders, support for murderous dictatorships and corrupt regimes in the form of money, weapons, and military training, corporate bank and state orchestrated political economies designed to extract wealth and exploit labor, and soft power cultural hegemony. This US imperialism has both enriched the metropole and distorted every country it has touched. American urbanism has been globalized through empire. Neither the profoundly uneven prosperity of contemporary US cities nor their remarkable diversity makes sense without confronting the history of US imperialism. And this is particularly true when we speak about immigration. US imperialism has been responsible for bloodshed, corruption, poverty, and dispossession in countries around the world. And these have generated vast dislocations, which are at the root of so much migration over the past half a century. We can see this plainly in the language of the immigrant rights movement, with protest slogans such as, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," or in the phrasing of Sri Lankan British activist and author A. Sivanandan, "We are here because you were there." Although Sivanandan was speaking about the British Empire, the statement is equally applicable to the United States. If we look around at the stunning diversity of today's American cities, how many different groups are here because we, the US, were there? Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, surely, as I've written about, Salvadorans and Guatemalans, without a doubt, Haitians, my goodness, but not only Latin Americans, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Cambodians, Afghans. I could go on, unfortunately. As journalist and former young lord Juan Gonzalez put it, immigration is the harvest of empire. But we don't only see empire in the shifting demographics of American cities, we see it in the power wielded from these cities as well. First, as many urban historians have already documented, a great deal of post-war urban and suburban prosperity was based on defense spending, which is a horrible euphemism if you think about it, given that aggression is what actually pervades much of US military history. Second, US cities have often been the command centers for empire, home to the politicians, banks, corporations, and other agents that have directed US imperialism. In 1957, the famed Afro-Puerto Rican author and activist Jesus Colon wrote a story in which the narrator exhorted his grandmother not to leave the colonized space of Puerto Rico to join her family in New York City. He wrote, "I know there is need and poverty all around you, and discrimination and economic and cultural oppression there. Something called imperialism sees to it that these things are not wiped out. Still, I think I ought to tell you that the most important men and forces interested in keeping people poor and ignorant and fighting wars one against the other have their offices in one short street in this New York to which your relatives are trying to bring you. For most imperial migrants dislocated to US cities, there was no refuge from American empire. Instead, they only came closer to its center, right into the belly of the beast. While migration brought them nearer the wealth and power of the metropole, borders of segregation and discrimination kept most of them from accessing that wealth and power. As the Nuyorican poet Pedro Pietri described the Puerto Rican workers in New York, quote, who came to this country to make a fortune and were buried without underwears. So how can we as urban scholars reckon with this reality and make it visible? For example, how can we tell the history of the 250,000 Salvadorans who live in and around Washington, D.C.? In the 1980s, the US funded and armed a brutal right-wing dictatorship in El Salvador, whose US-trained military and security forces were responsible for massacres, torture, and disappearances. 1 million Salvadorans were displaced by the US-sponsored violence, more than half of whom came to the United States, many settling in DC. Do those who lost loved ones pass in the streets the American policymakers responsible for their loss? Do their grandchildren go to school together? Or does the racial and class segregation that pervades our nation and its capital prevent that? However we might approach weaving together these stories, urban scholars must confront the fact that US cities are home both to those displaced by US intervention, as well as to those who perpetrated it, both to the harvest of empire and to its architects. My attention here to the imperialist dislocation spurring immigration is not meant to obscure migrants' own agency. On the contrary, migrants move in spite of the overwhelming desire of US empire to keep them in their place, so to speak. Each border crossed is a protest against systems designed to maintain inequality by restricting human mobility. Imperialism relies on the militarization of borders, the mammoth architecture of mass exclusion that keeps the world's population from following its extracted wealth and resources to the metropole. The same military power that makes home countries unlivable makes borders uncrossable. The long history of militarized migrant exclusion has made a fortress out of our country, has left refugees and asylum seekers clinging to the wheels of airplanes, walking through deserts and jungles, crossing seas and rivers, risking their lives only to face the near certainty of forceful return if they survive the journey. When I look at American cities through this lens, what I'm struck by is the relative absence of immigrants. Why are there not little cobbles in every major American city? Militarized mass exclusion serves to perpetuate the global inequalities forged by imperialism. An empire has the power not only to exclude, but also to expel. In this revanchist era of white return to urban America, we see the power of capital and gentrification displacing working class Black and Latinx people out into still segregated suburbs and secondary cities. But we must also see the gaps left in communities of color by deportations. The criminalization and caging of Black and Latinx people has led to their removal not only from their communities, but often beyond the borders of our nation. More than 3/4 of Black deportees, for example, are removed on criminal grounds, often for low-level offenses. The migrant exclusion system has become a mechanism to hyper-punish Black and Latinx people entrapped by the carceral state, and to forcefully purge the nation and its cities of criminalized immigrants. Mass migrant exclusion doesn't only keep and push people out, it dramatically impacts the lives of those living within US cities as well, many of whom are divided from their families by militarized borders. Our cities are simply full of people who cannot live with those they love, their children, for example, because of US exclusionary immigration systems. Further, many immigrants, particularly the undocumented, face denial of social benefits, reliance on a criminalized informal economy, and the constant threat of the violence of deportation. When, against the odds, migrants manage to evade the architecture of mass exclusion, they often remain marginalized and vulnerable in the US. They must exist beyond the protections of the state, however meager and racialized we know such protections are. As became clear during the pandemic, immigrants are simultaneously treated as essential and disposable. Like the military technology arrayed along the border and the detention centers where immigrants are incarcerated, the precarious position of the undocumented is meant to serve as a deterrent to others' immigration. Oppression is itself a tool of exclusion, and vice versa. Even if they are documented, working class and poor immigrants, particularly those who are Black and Latinx, are subject to an array of restrictions, vulnerabilities, exploitations, and indignities. This reality shapes our city in countless and often invisible ways. Indeed, I would argue that immigrant precarity is a central feature of contemporary American urbanism. It influences cities' economies, public health, disaster relief, policing, housing, to offer just a few examples. We see militarized migrant exclusion when Haitians are being whipped in Texas by the Border Patrol, as we should, but we must learn to see it too when immigrants are drowned in flooded basements in Queens, or when they commit suicide at Rikers. As we've been shown by historians like Jessica Kim, Kelly Little Hernandez, Peter James Hudson, Andrew Friedman, and Johanna Fernandez, US urbanism is deeply interwoven with imperialism. I argue that these intersections persist in the contemporary era. American empire and the militarized mass exclusion that enables it defines our cities, and it's my hope that our work can make that visible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lana. That was wonderful. Okay, next, we're going to hear from Andy Horowitz. And before I introduce Professor Horowitz, please keep the questions coming in the Q&A. We have good questions coming in, so let's keep it going. Andy Horowitz is Associate Professor of History and the Paul and Deborah Gibbons Professor in the School of Liberal Arts at Tulane University. His research explores disasters and the questions they give rise to about race, class, community trauma, inequality, the welfare state, metropolitan development, extractive industry, and environmental change. He is the author of Katrina, A History, 1915 to 2015, published with Harvard University Press in 2020. And Critical Disaster Studies, co-edited with Jacob Reams, which came out with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2021. He also served as a guest editor for Human Nature, a 2021 special issue of Southern Cultures. He has been busy this year, along with Dustin. He also published essays in the Atlantic Time, Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. It's yours, Andy.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation and quite honored by the company. So thank you for having me here. By way of introduction, I'll just say again that my work as a historian is focused on disasters, these moments that most people imagine to be without histories, acute attacks that come out of nowhere to upset the normal order of things. And my work pursues a different idea. And simply stated, it's that disasters have histories. So my research on disasters fits with a broader interest in trying to help to write a usable past for the climate crisis, try to offer precedents that can inform our sense of challenges that are often described as unprecedented. In my book, I trace Katrina's causes and consequences across a century in order to show how the places we live and the disasters that imperil them are at once products of state policy, cultural imagination, economic order, and environmental possibility. And tonight I thought I would offer a very condensed version of a story that animated my research and to explain how it informs my understanding of the city broadly. And it's a story about a woman named Ida Bell Carter. Carter was the granddaughter of enslaved people born in 1927 in a place that for most of its human history was known by the Choctaw name Balbuncha, but that Ida Bell knew as New Orleans. She grew up in an older neighborhood called Central City and continued to live there after she married Ike Joshua, a veteran of World War II. Then in 1949, the Housing Authority announced plans to expand a nearby public housing development called the Magnolia Projects and to demolish the house that the Joshuas were renting. So the Joshuas decided to build themselves a new house. And they moved just east of a waterway called the Industrial Canal. It's one of many such canals across the Louisiana coast that were built to serve shipping and oil interests. And this canal split the Ninth Ward, New Orleans Ninth Ward, in half. the Joshuas moved to the downriver side, called the lower Ninth Ward. And you can see in the sketch how the Joshuas' choices were constrained. A federally funded redevelopment project was displacing them from their current home. Ike's GI Bill incentivized building a new house. The Joshuas were African American, and so racist law and custom prevented them from considering most new New Orleans neighborhoods. But the lower Ninth was a welcoming place for Black people seeking to fulfill that ranch house on slab post-war American dream. And when she moved there, in the neighborhood, in Ida Bell's words, was thriving. Well, fast forward to 1965. It's when Hurricane Betsy pushed a storm surge into the industrial canal. Its floodwalls collapsed and the Joshua's house flooded. In response, Ida Bell and her neighbors organized as the Betsy flood victims. They advocated for $10,000 grants about the average value of their homes that would allow them to rebuild with autonomy, perhaps on higher ground. But instead, Congress offered them loans via the Small Business Administration. These were second mortgages, in effect, secured against their flooded real estate. And the policy made it financially impossible for them to consider moving elsewhere. So like most of her neighbors, Ida Bell Joshua rebuilt in the lower Ninth. And the decades that followed, while she raised her children and earned a degree in social work at Tulane, where I teach, the Army Corps of Engineers was constructing a new levee system around New Orleans and its suburbs. This was an ambitious project meant to protect a metropolis large enough to accommodate suburban sprawl, a growing Black middle class, white flight. In fact, the Army Corps' cost-benefit analysis worked because the project would support new development in flood-prone areas. But at the same time, oil canals were causing the coastal wetlands beyond those concrete walls to collapse, bringing the Gulf of Mexico ever closer to the city, which itself was sinking. So now fast forward again to 2005, when Hurricane Katrina pushed another storm surge into the same industrial canal. Again, the Army Corps' flood walls failed, and again, Ida Bell Joshua's home filled with water. This time, after 56 years there, Joshua could not imagine abandoning her neighborhood. So she used her retirement savings to have her house gutted, and she was waiting to learn the details of the federal program that promised to help her rebuild. It was called the Road Home. Now, know that the formula that HUD approved for the Road Home capped grants to flooded homeowners at the house's market value rather than the cost of repairs. Because of racism in the real estate market, this effectively made homeowners in white neighborhoods eligible for larger grants than homeowners in African-American neighborhoods, even for comparable damage. And besides, the private contractor who administered the program was inept. And so Ida Bell waited and waited nearly 2 years to hear from the Road Home. And through it all, she was living in temporary housing 100 miles away. But through all that time, she kept her lawn cut. It was a signal to her neighbors that she would be coming home. In May 2007, the city of New Orleans sent a letter to Joshua's empty home saying that the house had been condemned. So Joshua eventually got the letter. She filed an appeal, and in July, she went to City Hall to protest, and she was assured not to worry. So the next day, Joshua asked her nephew to go mow the lawn, please. And when he arrived the next day, he discovered that the city had bulldozed her house. So I offer this terrible story today, in part because I mean for it to clarify what I meant when I said that my research is organized around the idea that disasters have histories. Katrina's causes and consequences are not constrained to the time when the city was filled with water. We have to look, of course, to the policies that put people in harm's way and kept them there, to the arrangements that allowed the flood to occur, and to the policies that compounded the catastrophe afterward. And I hope you can also see in the story, as I do, an agenda for cities and urban historians today. And I'll identify briefly a few specific points. First, we have to consider how the climate crisis intersects and extends with what is sometimes called the urban crisis. The challenges that we tend to label as climate change are rarely entirely new, and they're rarely exclusively about the climate. They unsettle the moral bases of capitalism and its pursuit of growth. They undermine the legitimacy of state action, which often hurts under the name of help. And they upset the processes of culture that give life its meaning as people try to make sense of wrenching change. And phrased this way, it's clear that we're just awash in historical precedents that can help us make sense of our current predicament. Second, we need to continue to write across subfields and subdisciplines to consider urban history at the scale of environmental history without losing sight of how change is experienced by people at the human scale. Katrina happened at Ida Bell Joshua's house. It also happened in the lower Ninth, in metropolitan New Orleans, on the Gulf Coast in the South in the United States. Katrina happened during George W. Bush's presidency. It happened in post-war America. It happened in the age of the Anthropocene. Each of these spatial and temporal frames reveal some parts of the story while obscuring others, so we need them all. Third, the story suggests how some policies and practices that define 20th century America are unraveling in the 21st. Consider, for example, the metropolitan sprawl that made single-family homes affordable and vulnerable, or the National Flood Insurance Program that subsidized construction in flood-prone areas, the infrastructure built for cars, the reliance on oil and gas, the hope that limitless growth could somehow provide for all without the need for redistribution from any. And finally, the story brings me back to some of the fundamental questions of urban history. And I think of what the great New Orleans writer Kalamu Yasalam wrote in 2006. He wrote, "Those of us living in post-Katrina New Orleans find ourselves engaged in this difficult quest to know ourselves as we struggle to save New Orleans. Every day we are faced with difficult choices," he wrote. "Every day we ask ourselves, what is this New Orleans we want to save? What is this New Orleans we want to save?" It's a question with renewed urgency today, with Hurricane Ida offering fresh evidence of the stronger storms that we can expect in a changed climate. But it also calls to mind those enduringly productive questions about what defines a city altogether. Is a city a certain built environment? Is it a certain population density, a set of economic relationships? Is it the ideas that cohere around those relationships or arrangements? Because surely we don't want to save the New Orleans that in its racial and economic inequalities simply extends the history of dispossession of the native home of people or the trauma of enslavement and Jim Crow. Rather, we must admit those horrors while working to disentangle them from the world historical achievement of jazz, from the modest virtuosity of the Creole Shotgun House, from the neighborhood solidarity of the Social Aid and Pleasure Club. And most of all, one wants to say that New Orleans history is America's history, and Katrina represents America's possible future. So rather than lingering on those extraordinary specificities, we can affirm the basic human dignity due people who live in New Orleans or anywhere, and work together to try to change the course of our urban history for the better. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Andy. Okay, next up is Minju Bay, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Her research investigates how Asian Americans navigated the politics of work, racial difference, and the radical restructuring of the urban-based global economy in the late 20th century. She's also a member of the Ending the Korean War Collective and the Asian Pacific American Voices, a COVID-19 public memory project. Minju, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know we're already at an hour, so this is great. I'm learning so much from everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers, to the support staff, my co-panelists who I admire so deeply. My research is very much informed by so much of the incredible work of so many scholars who are part of the UHA. So I'm really honored to be in this session. To give you a sense of where I'm coming from, as Professor Hinton just mentioned, I'm a postdoc at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. My research examines the history of labor organizing in New York City's Asian community since the 1970s. I do this by studying Asian communities, both migrant and Asian American, in an array of workplaces, looking at multiple labor organizing strategies in New York City. And so when I was thinking about how I might contribute to tonight's session, I thought I'd follow the lead of one grassroots organization in particular, CAV, Organizing Asian Communities. This organization's work has been deeply inspiring and important in my life as a historian and an activist. To give some background, just briefly, CAV had been called the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence when it was first founded in 1986. So it was originally an organization that organized against what they called hate incidents, or specific instances of violence against Asian people, whether the perpetrator was a cop or a neighbor. And in addition to this work, they also often organized with families of victims of police violence in multiracial coalitions. Their mission has since evolved as their organization has grown. And I just want to point to sort of a pivotal moment in this organization's history. In the mid-1990s, sort of early to mid-1990s, as the staff and members began to notice a pattern of violence against South Asian cab drivers in New York City, the organization shifted its mission to think about anti-Asian violence as a systemic problem. And so, like so many Asian Americanists and urbanists, I know we're already feeling quite heavy from a lot of the things that we've already been talking about today. But I've been thinking a lot about anti-Asian violence, especially in this pandemic. But a lot of the rhetoric has really been about individualized instances of hate, or the necessity for hate crimes legislation, or new policies that increase police funding and power. But like Cav had articulated back in the 1990s, anti-Asian violence is indeed systemic. So I'm thinking about tenants being harassed all the time by their landlords, or how international finance, capital, or free trade agreements might expel people out of their home countries to arrive in places like New York. And then, of course, sort of the most present one is when wars have created refugee crises and then they settle them in American cities. So Cav's lesson to think about anti-Asian violence as a systemic problem and a symptom of Orientalism has really helped me to process the pandemic and otherwise. And I think this organization really imparts wisdom for us to think about cities differently. And so for the next kind of 5 minutes or so, I want to think about the problem of systemic anti-Asian violence as it relates to urban history as a field. So in my work, anti-Asian violence manifests in a lot of ways. Job discrimination. So when a new public housing project was slated for Manhattan's Chinatown in the mid-1970s, no Asian Americans were hired, neither from Chinatown nor elsewhere. Right, so that's one instance. Or another manifestation is on the job or workplace violence. I'm thinking about the South Asian cab drivers that Cav who Cav organized with. And then maybe this is another instance of workplace violence, the killings of massage parlor workers in Atlanta that happened in March. There's also the erasure of Asian communities entirely, which is itself a political violence. The model minority narrative casts Asian Americans as upwardly mobile or docile. And this narrative obscures the majority of New York's Asian communities, which is predominantly working class and poor. And so this erasure, as we're thinking about cities, gets translated into our built environment, into real estate, into property development. So for example, in the late 1990s and in the wake of 9/11, New York's garment manufacturing really takes a hit, and jobs continue to move overseas at an accelerated rate. And this is for a whole host of reasons, and I can get into that later if you'd like. But what this means is that these garment factories are then illegally converted or rezoned for more profitable endeavors like hotels, art galleries, office spaces for .coms or tech companies in today's verbiage. And then garment workers lose their jobs, and then they become doubly invisibilized by the model minority narrative, and then again invisibilized by the near elimination of their job sector. So, and I mean, I think this list can go on and on about the ways in which anti-Asian violence manifests. I also want to clarify that when individuals are attacked for perceptions about, let's say, China, such as in the case of the so-called Chinese virus that we saw during the pandemic, this is of course also a systemic problem and not an arbitrary instance of hate. So in my trying to understand our present, this is the presentist call from Professor Taylor. So in trying to understand the present, as the US shores up weapons and military might in the Pacific and pivots to Asia, Asian communities in US cities are contending with what that might mean for their community amidst perceived dangers of China. And so I'm really thinking about what paths our current moment has. One way to think about this is, in my research, anti-communism was an ever-present problem for Asian American laborers looking to organize their workplaces. And part of this was the Cold War's context. both intensifying and softening US relations with China, for example. In New York, Asian American workers, especially East Asian workers, were worried about being perceived as communist in the context of the local business owners, let's say Chinese restaurants, the management there, who were overtly anti-communist party Chinese Americans, who used the specter of the Communist Party to bust unionization efforts. So then these Cold War geopolitics were playing out in the dining hall of restaurants as servers and cooks were looking to organize unions for better wages and job security. And so I think about how all of this past has shaped New York City. And something that I'd also like to think more about is the kind of Asian investments that are happening that has contributed to very conservative and entrepreneurial rhetoric around racial belonging, instead of positioning American cities like New York as aspirational places for finance, global capitalism, and deepening anti-communist zeal. And then the sentiment really kind of reverberates in the communities themselves in cities. So I'm asking kind of broadly, how has the specter of Asia and the associated need to dominate Asia shaped American cities? There's of course great books on this. I'm thinking in particular about Nayan Shah's work, which has been so important for me and my students to visit over and over during the pandemic. And this book is about Orientalism in San Francisco's Chinatown in a much earlier period than the one I study. And so I'm thinking about what possibilities might be, what the possibilities might be for urbanists if we extended this periodization and self-centeredly to the recent past. I wonder about global cities as highly localized sites of US imperial dominance. And I know that next week's plenary is about global cities, so I don't want to really steal their thunder, but I'm sort of adding on to Professor Barber's take on imperial dominance and as it relates to cities. And so kind of in summation, in the context of the ongoing Cold War and in the Empire State, in my case, New York's Asian communities were confronted with the systemic realities of anti-Asian violence and Orientalism, and it really shaped their relationship to the city. I think I'll stop there, and I'm so happy to think out loud with all of you during Q&A about how Orientalism might shape American cities. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Minju. That was excellent. Okay, last but definitely not least, we are going to hear from Kwame Holmes, who is the director of the Kingston Housing Lab, a scholar in residence in the Human Rights Project at Bard College, and cohort mentor of the Bard Bachelorette program. He is a critical geographer, historian, and cultural critic with a particular interest in the emotional politics of urban development and inequality. He reads the history of modern cities and social movements through a Black queer studies frame, and his work has appeared in Radical History Review, Occasion, and No Tea, No Shade, New Writings, and Black Queer Studies. He is at work revising a book manuscript entitled Queer Removal, Liberalism and Displacement in the Nation's Capital. Kwame, please wrap up this first kind of opening set of discussions.
Thanks so much for that, Elizabeth, and really grateful to the organizers for asking me to be here today. So when thinking about what to say tonight, I kept returning to the fact that I would be speaking to you from my apartment rather than before you in a hotel conference room. It is a vast understatement, I think, to say that COVID has done funny things to geography, and that's the underlying premise of my comments tonight. To be more specific, I'm speaking to you from Kingston, New York, which is 8 miles from Bard College, which is where I teach, and is about 80 miles north of New York City in Ulster County, the other side of the river from the more well-off Dutchess County. I've lived here 2.5 years, well more than half of which is sort of COVID time. And if you aren't a student of New York history and don't know that Kingston was the first capital of this state, you may have encountered it in the pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post, being described as the hottest real estate market in the country amidst a historic national land grab. In 2020, home prices increased by an average of 34%, and the volume of purchases increased by 90%. That's in 1 year. The simple narrative is that New York City is colonizing this small town, so deeply nestled near the Catskills and amidst vast rural Western New York. And as a housing organizer, it's certainly true that working class people and people of color, undocumented folks are facing unprecedented housing insecurity. And Kingston's once vibrant working class population is being scattered to Albany, Poughkeepsie, and Ellenville. But the story is also more complicated and has a longer history. So sort of ironically, COVID might draw our attention to dynamics whose explanation actually exceed the pandemic itself and require some historicism. I want to talk about two of those dynamics. First is that New York City was already here. In a recent class on gentrification at Bard, my students and I studied property tax records in one of the city's poorest and blackest neighborhoods, and where there had been rapid recent real estate turnover. We were astonished to find that more than half of the owners in that neighborhood did not live in Kingston, and nearly 40% were based in New York City, Brooklyn and Manhattan, respectively. Though there are no multi-unit apartment buildings in the neighborhood, there is an invisible divide between single-family homes that owners live in and those that are rented by absentee landlords. Now, we know that New Yorkers enjoy vacationing in the area, skiing in the Catskills, for example, but there's a transience which explains that relation. Those folks describe themselves as weekenders, for example, and we make sense of their presence by framing urban and rural as opposites. Weekenders leave the city to escape, right? But if we were to map Kingston as a set of financial flows in and out of its borders, then the most impoverished sections of the city could be described as having a more intimate relationship with New York City than with other neighborhoods or towns that are more nearby. There's little transient about this transplanted New York, as tax records indicate that some New Yorkers have owned these properties for decades. I use the phrase financial flows in and out on purpose, because this is the language political scientists use to describe the behavior of Western corporate entities, often mining concerns, who capitalize on less regulated labor markets and custom systems in the global South. Similarly, Kingston's small townness creates a favorable environment for speculative real estate investment. Local landlords and municipal regulators are often members of the same family, and this means lax code enforcement and landlord-friendly housing courts. Whatever disdain New Yorkers have for the country, these real estate investors are able to make hay out of this geography. Hope that you are laughing at that joke. I cannot see any of you. This is an urban history in need of telling, and one that I suspect could fold in the recent history of towns like Newburgh, Hudson, and other nearby mid-sized cities. Here's an example of this dynamic. If New York or Toronto were our guide, we could periodize the end of urban single-room occupancy or boarding houses and tie it to specific reform movements. But here in New York's Wild West, the boarding room persists and has housed hundreds of people who subsist well below the poverty line. One such boarding house, Chisholm's Hart Street, owned by a conglomerate of local and New York City-based investors, was recently sold to a Brooklyn-based hospitality concern, who will be converting it to a bed and breakfast. In working to help rehouse the residents, I was again astonished to find that none of them had actual lease agreements. All of them received federal SSI payments each month, which they turned over to the manager, who they thought was the owner. She wasn't. And then she in turn paid the owners. So just on one rather quaint street, because this boarding house was actually a complex of 4 buildings, thinking again about financial flows, you have federal welfare dollars coming in. They leave to go to people in Woodstock, in Red Hook, and in New York City. And within that kind of maelstrom of financial flows, you have neglected tenants, right? Whose poor living conditions are producing profit for people who don't live near them. So if the first dynamic is New York City is already here, then the second dynamic is that New Yorkers were already here. And interspersed with that is that Kingston was already in New York. I think a lot of urban historians, or maybe just me, have wondered where that first generation of Giuliani-era gentrifiers went after their neighborhoods became too expensive even for them. We know that that sort of gentrification is an ongoing urban phenomenon, but I'm really focused on the white, very often gay artists who transformed Bushwick in the 1990s. Despite being historians, we have a tendency to not imagine change over time for our actual subjects, people who we study. And so we haven't thought about how those gentrifiers plan for their retirement, especially the gay ones who won't have children to help take care of them later in life. Where did they go? They went to the country, as it turns out. There are dozens of white gay landlords in Kingston who have been here for over a decade and helped to provide affordable lodgings for their friends, purchase their first homes, and to engage into a slower pace of life. And again, our models of gay urban history just haven't thought through that yet. And so what's sort of ironic is that these white gay gentrifiers, men, primarily men, but also some lesbians, they've found like security in the so-called unfriendly rural, rather than in places like the village, which they've been priced out of. And that irony exists in a number of other different frames as well. So when you start to look at many of the New Yorkers who are now buying homes, like my lesbian neighbors, they aren't pure New Yorkers who are escaping, but they're folks with local history who grew up in the area who are returning home. So there's a lot of interesting social and cultural history to be done here. And it's not entirely clear whether it's a history of New York City or Kingston, or perhaps more accurately, we can begin to conceive of urban subjects in a more expansive and nuanced way. The models for this sort of scholarship may actually be colonial history, a field which thinks about the imbrication between and mutual constitution of the metropole and the periphery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Kwame. That was wonderful. And thank you to all the panelists. I've learned so much from your remarks. I think you have just offered us just such a rich discussion for the conversation. We have about 45 minutes and we're going to get right to it. Please continue to offer questions using the Q&A chat box. You can ask groups of panelists, individual panelists, the entire panel. But we've got a great one here. So I'm just going to read this verbatim. It says, thank you to the panelists for their compelling remarks. I'm curious to hear panelists' perspectives on history as a discipline and its often conservative notion of what constitutes scholarly rigor in the discipline. While as urban historians, we often engage pressing issues confronting cities today and embrace public scholarship as a means to promote collaboration with local grassroots organizations, our departmental colleagues view this public work with suspicion and contempt. How can we as urban historians reframe what counts as legitimate historical scholarship so that we can do the work we know we need to do? Such an important question. I'm excited to hear what you all have to say. Do you need me to read?
Everyone's being so polite.
So what, go ahead, Lana.
Yeah, I don't have a full answer to that. I mean, I think that as has already been discussed tonight, there are so many massive issues of power that we have to address within higher education, within academia, and how to make our colleagues recognize the essentialness of public work is a fantastic question that I'm afraid I can't fully answer. But what I will say is that in as I think was clear in what I talked about tonight, and is obvious in all of my favorite books, we learn how to think from social movements. We learn how to critique. We learn how to have a vision of something different. As smart as I think we all are, right? We don't necessarily sit home in our house, in our apartments, and have genius ideas, right? We learn how to see the world from movements that are rising up around us and that have been rising up since humans existed, right? So that I don't know how to persuade our colleagues of that value, but I would just say from my perspective, that is the work, that is the most essential work, to be listening and amplifying the most critical, radical, visionary visions, forgive me for saying that twice, of the movements that surround us.
I'll say something really quickly. Yeah, so it's a great question. I think that the important consideration is institutional resources and relative protections. I mean, I work at a university that would seem, so far I'm new, but even at my previous place of employment, the University of Chicago, would seem to value public facing work, would seem to kind of celebrate and acknowledge an op-ed in the New York Times or elsewhere. But to me, the question is, how do we avoid the kind of the kind of suffocation of potentially a kind of radical set of ideas embedded in the prose, and reframing that as a way to just get butts in the seat, because there's a way in which kind of public facing scholarship can get reframed as serving enrollments and boosting revenues, et cetera. And then to think it's important to think about the relationship between what is said through public facing work, organizing or otherwise, and then the ways that gets kind of interpreted and perhaps kind of distended when in the hands of one's colleagues. But again, the key piece to me is the university or place, the kind of culture that you work at. I happen to be at a place that seems to be supportive, but now forced to think about these other issues now that I've done some public facing work.
Anyone else want to comment on this? I mean, I would hope too that that part of it is generational, that when, you know, new generations come to power that actually do recognize other, you know, things outside the traditional boxes of scholarship as rigorous and scholarly, then we'll be able to push the discipline forward. We'll be able to push our colleagues forward.
If I would just add to that, I mean, it's sort of an obvious statement, but I'm sorry, I'm sorry, Elizabeth, did I cut you off?
No, you did not at all.
Okay, thank
Please,
you.
You're free to cut me off.
So just to add to that too, and I think as part of this too, I agree. I think that in my sense of this is that this is changing, although I think that the concern with which this question is being posed is very real at certain places. But I think just kind of piggybacking on what has been said so far, that of course, then it is also in part reliant on you know, if you are someone who, or if there are people within the department who have more power, who have tenure, who already have a secure place within the university, to be the ones who are then supporting the people who are doing this kind of, exactly this kind of work that we're valuing, right? That sort of relationship is not simply up to the people who are trying to do this work, who especially might be more vulnerable to the kind of pressures that, you know, as younger scholars or just be more, you know, endangered if they're doing that kind of work at a place that's more hostile to it, to them, if you're maybe not doing that work, but if you're in the position where you can be supportive of that work as a position, as somebody with more power or resources to just encourage one to do that. So thanks.
And on that too, there was a request from Melanie Newport to say who the questions were from. So that one was from Robin Backen. Thank you so much for that question, Robin. And if you, I don't want to discourage you from asking a question if you want to remain anonymous. So if you don't want your name said, you still want to ask a question, please do, just tell me. And I won't say who you are. We have a question in the chat that is near and dear to my heart from A.K. Sandoval Strauss. And they say, one of the concerns of many urbanists in past years was an overemphasis on really big cities. Could we get some further comments building on the last presentation about what we can say about the many second and third and fourth order cities in which so many Americans live? Thank you so much for that question. I see lots of nods, so.
Do I have to say more? Have I said enough on it? I feel like I might have said too many things. No, yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting, like just spending time here and realizing, you know, how much my time in big cities like shaped the questions that I asked about the past, you know? And so I think part of it, the problem is just that institutionally, a lot of our, where we were trained or where we wanted to live were cities, and that's sort of driven our research. I don't know what is there to say. I mean, one of the things that I'm also really interested in being here is I've been sort of playing around with the classic phrase about New York, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. But sometimes you like can't make it there. And so you then leave and you go to like Kingston or what have you, and you run for office or you like start like a social movement. So there's this way in which the New York City, like in larger cities, will seed smaller areas with people who then become leaders, but they're like, and especially within the Black community, what's really fascinating is for local whites who want to partner with Black leaders, they'll take anyone. They don't care if there's an indigenous connection to the community. They're like, you're Black and you can be a political leader. But and that can produce conflict within people who have, there are people in Kingston, I mean, it's the first capital of New York, who have families that go all the way back to, the earliest Dutch settlements and slave owners. So and those intra-racial dynamics, I think, are really important, and the kind of, and that they think they can get lost in a kind of more simple Black-white story that can dominate in big cities. So those are two thoughts I have.
Yeah, I would love to chime in with that as well. Having, written for my first book on specifically a small city that, had about 80,000 people in it, it's interesting to me the way that I also was concerned with flows of capital in and out of the city, that there is something about, at least as urban historians, studying small cities that allow you to kind of get a big picture view on it in a way that sometimes we can just be overwhelmed by places like New York or Los Angeles, and to be able to see it whole, see what comes in, see what gets out, and really kind of be able to unpack it and disentangle it. And once we see, once you can take it apart and see how it works inside, you realize that those are the same functionings that are happening in larger cities as well. You're just better able to unpack them sometimes in smaller cities. But also, I think that it's really important to remember, as we all acknowledge that gentrification and displacement are happening, I think there's a real danger for urban historians in getting a little caught up in the glamour and sophistication of places like New York and Los Angeles, and not realize that many of the working class Black immigrant communities that we want to study, that we think are important to center in our research, don't live in those glamorous cities anymore, or increasingly are being pushed out of those glamorous cities. And so the awareness, on some level, if we are really committed to history from below and studying, marginalized communities, disenfranchised communities, racialized communities, we're going to have to reckon with the fact that New Jersey is the new Brooklyn, right? I mean, that this is really a transformation that's happening, and we can't like get swept up by the beautiful city lights and stay in the big metropolitan areas.
Such an important point, Lana. Thank you for that.
Maybe just to add a totally obvious point from the perspective of, but the two places that I've written about and studied are New Orleans and New Haven. And it's true when you look from a certain view, yes, maybe you can get a handle on a global or transnational process. You can see how an economy works in a smaller place. But looking at it from the other perspective, just from the people that live there, these are the most important places in the world. This is home. This is where grandma lives. It's the only place you've ever known, and to sort of respect that too. And it's not just a sort of knowable example of something else. It's not a laboratory. It's, and it's easy to make that claim. People are very easily convinced by the claim that New Orleans matters because they love New Orleans and they think it's reducible to, a Tuesday in the spring called Mardi Gras, when in fact, that's not what most people love about New Orleans. And when I've written about New Haven, people think it's just Yale, rather than a place where Yale is and other things are. So anyway, just by way of agreement, I guess I want to say that we also want to look from the perspective that live in these places, people live in these places and care about them deeply because they're home.
I was really intrigued in the question that the question was what we can say. And one thing I think we can say is that it's by looking at smaller municipalities that we can also confirm that the municipal bond market is a neglectful institution at best and a punitive institution at worst. So one of the things I tried to do at the end of my book was kind of point to the ways in which, basically smaller municipalities are forced to pay a higher interest premium and penalty just off the strength of the lack of name recognition. So it's a big problem in the late 1960s if you're a small municipality effectively dealing with the problem of credit discrimination. So you could focus on the big cities, San Francisco, New York, the fiscal crisis course of the 1970s in NYC, or Chicago in the 1980s, but to speak to the power of bondholders and the kind of disciplinary power of the bond market itself. But you could also tell that same story by way of focusing in on small municipalities who are saying we're being discriminated for no particular reason, or rather just because we have a lack of name recognition. So that's one thing I think that you can say about those second, third, and fourth order cities.
I'll just say really quickly that, you know, I think all of this is true, and there certainly were, in my book, Race for Profit, there were certainly sort of smaller cities off the, out of the typical attention that we pay to, you know, big city markets that were important in the programs that I look at. But I do think that there does, I got a version of this question about, like, where is the research on housing in the South, for example? And, you know, I think that those are important. There are many important sites to look at, to try to understand what they tell us. But I also think that the idea that we have exhausted our understanding of what happens in large cities to poor and marginalized people can be overstated. For sure, there is a kind of glamorous city aspect to be aware of, but we know that there are multiple experiences that happen in cities and in big, you know, metropolitan areas and centers of capital. You get both the glamour of capitalism and you get the horrors of capitalism, and the experiences of poor and working class people, wherever they are marginalized and hidden and obscured and deserve to be unearthed and investigated and understood. And so I think that especially if we're thinking, you know, historically about what has happened in cities over the last 40 or 50 years, that, you know, I think that understanding what happened to the Black working class, to Latinx workers in New York City remains
is Professor Horowitz earlier sort of asked us this question about what makes a city, and I'm sort of thinking about, like, so when this question gets posed about second, third, fourth order cities, I mean, I study New York, so I guess maybe in some sense I don't really have any foundations to speak on this, but I kind of, I like, at some point I sort of lose sight of what a city is. And I think it's kind of, I think it's also, earlier someone, I'm sorry, I can't remember who said this, but thinking about cities expansively, and maybe it's about networks and people moving in, people moving out, people working in specific sites. Maybe like the city can be understood beyond just the physical streets and the buildings, but rather the kinds of things it can teach us about how power works. But I do appreciate this question about, I do think that I mean, we should be able to study everything, is I think what it comes down to for me. So that's not really, back to you.
Oh, thank you for that. All right, we have some more great questions coming in. I also really like this one from Matthew Toland. And they say, for all panelists, in the context of their remarks tonight, what are the most important concrete policy tools, i.e. zoning, incentives, et cetera, that urban planners and policymakers should consider when looking to mitigate or even ameliorate the problems, challenges that you've uncovered in your research? Love this question, because that's what we need to be doing, is thinking about solutions, how our research helps us get towards solutions and what those policy solutions should look like. So what are they?
Well, the thing that we're pushing for really hard right now in Kingston is the passage of a good cause eviction law. And that was just passed in Albany. And these are not perfect solutions for controlling median rent price because, in case people aren't aware, the idea is that the municipality can create standards for what it counts as a good reason to evict. And so Kingston has proposed that a person's inability to pay rent, if it's been increased by more than 5%, is not a good reason to evict, unless there's some other stipulations like the landlord has to demonstrate certain amount of maintenance, so there are loopholes. The reason why I guess it's encouraging is because it really is showing the creativity of local lawmakers to get around what are the draconian and high bar for passing rent control in New York State. There's this Emergency Tenant Protection Act, which requires for a city to do a vacancy rate study that shows that the vacancy rate is no greater than 5%, and landlords lie a lot in those studies because they have to self-report. So it's really hard to pass actual rent control measures. And so even though good cause eviction has loopholes, I just am encouraged by it because it shows that lawmakers are like sort of desperately creative in trying to figure out a way to solve the housing security problem all over the state.
Can I just say, I like to come at this in a slightly different way. And, I think policy is obviously important. I teach public policy. But I think in something like housing, it's a different kind of question, which is, why don't these policies work, right? Like, we have any number of laws on the books that prohibit discrimination and buying and renting and financing. We have all sorts of laws that make what we read about in the newspapers every day about redlining and housing discrimination illegal. And so I was trying to ask a different kind of question in my book, which is, how does our federal and local governments insistence on yoking housing production and our entire conception of housing in this country to the private sector not only undermine its ability to then enforce this bevy of laws that exist, but how does that then completely undermine then the efforts to create affordable and accessible housing in the first place? And for me, that really is the question is, how do we disconnect capital from public policy if we are going to be serious about actually creating equitable housing and access for people in this country? And that's a complicated question. There is no policy on offer or being talked about of how to get the real estate and banking industries out of the creation of housing for ordinary people. So that's a slightly different way that I try to approach this question about, do we need another law that will, for the first time in 54 years, increase the number of Black homeowners in this country? Or might we look at, why have the laws that have existed since 1968 not increased the number of Black homeowners in 54 years?
Maybe just to hit the question from a totally different angle, inspired by Professor Taylor there, just to say that if one cared, for example, about a city in view of any coast, then the most important urban policy might seem to be a rapid and just decarbonization.
Benjamin. I mean, I think this question really was for everybody. I'd like to hear what everybody has to say. I think this
Yeah.
is really important. So I'm
No,
calling on everybody here.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I'm not going to point to any one particular tool. I'll sort of build a little bit off of what people have said, just to think of sort of some sort of add a couple things to the conversation. I mean, this is a different point than what Professor Taylor is making, and one that is not nearly as robust and rich. But I think, you know, part of what makes the sort of resurgence around community land trusts and other efforts to kind of decommodify housing and to make permanent housing and to kind of remove it from the private sector so exciting is in part it comes to at least help to address some of those the issues of with the sort of struggle to create ongoing forms of affordable housing that always often cycle out or don't remain as such. So it's been really encouraging to see, certainly in New York and really across the country and beyond, those kinds of solutions for creating community land trusts, not only towards kind of green spaces, but to create those kinds of permanently existing affordable housing structures. It's a model that is difficult to scale up, but I think it's an important one and one from which we can learn. I'll just add to this too. I think because one of those questions I think also makes me think a little bit about, you know, that a lot of these, this is far from a solution, but I mean, a lot of these issues, you know, certainly go beyond the city level. I think, you know, climate is obviously a really critical one, you know, not just in the sense that Denver or whatever city can pass really critical measures around climate. We need everything that we can, but that I think that there are these issues that really go beyond particular cities and really require much more robust federal and beyond solutions. And I think, you know, or another thing, city issue that we often think of as urban, you know, something like homelessness, this sort of effort by cities to have this kind of what ends up being this sort of competition to stamp out and remove homelessness on the individual level, taking homeless policies out or beyond an individual responses and applying and supplying more federal resources and initiatives towards addressing the ways that we know that homelessness can be successfully addressed, help to kind of undercut the more punitive policies that cities are consistently enacting around those kinds of issues. So just want to put that out there. Thanks.
Appreciate the question. I kind of think about this question largely in terms of audience. So the question of what are concrete policy tools that urban planners can take up? One way to approach, or at least I approach, is just kind of what I said at the beginning, is to think very critically about the trade-off and dilemmas. I mean, if we're thinking about climate change in particular and the mobilization of capital, what are some of the acceptable trade-offs? And this is a question that folks have to entertain. Is it acceptable to mobilize finance capital to provide critical infrastructure, even if it's through an ESG lens, even if it's through a sort of racially and economically just sort of framework? Is it acceptable to pursue that avenue if it means deepening the power of finance? So in short, I think about the question as you know, instead of thinking about public policy, let's take a step back to think about the dilemmas and trade-offs before us and before people who have to make those decisions. The second way I think about it is in terms of kind of what Dr. Taylor was saying, which is in terms of tactics, strategy, and overall objectives. The great interview Kienga did with Public Books, thinking about decommodification as a pursuit, not just with housing, but if infrastructure, water, sewage management is key to modern life, why is that tied to the market to begin with? So if the project then is one of decommodification, can one actually embrace public policy tools to do that? Or is there another terrain of struggle to which decommodification is possible, is attainable? And then the third way, if I'm talking to people who want best practices, real world solutions, I have to give a shout out to, and I'm gonna butcher her name here, Stacy Seishnadra, who is a legal scholar at Tulane. I saw your face. I butchered that, but she did an incredible, and I'm incredibly grateful for, her response to a book symposium that's ongoing on my work, The Bonds of Inequality. I'm just going to quote what she proposed. The book, by the way, just kind of talks, one thing it talks about is how different communities were effectively rendered unworthy of debt, different neighborhoods and projects rendered unworthy of debt. And what this professor says is, she says, quote, every development project powered by public subsidies should be required to demonstrate who benefits and how, whether it is perpetuating segregation or whether it is restoring choices and opportunity denied under law in prior decades. So that seems to me to be a useful public policy tool, mandating, I don't know if you frame that in terms of disclosure or something else, but if I'm talking to the public policy folks, and we can think about whether that serves the ultimate goal of decommodifying. But yeah, so to me, it's a question first and foremost of audience and who I'm talking to.
Yeah, and I'll second that. I mean, I have lots of policy ideas, none of which are going to be, it's like the fullest, it won't capture my understanding of a utopia. But as it relates to the kind of things that I spoke about tonight, what doesn't work is things like the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force, to increase police funding to then have more cops on the ground as a city level policy, and then sort of federally and then internationally sort of making that connection from this local to global thing is the increased militarization across the country and then into the Pacific of Asian communities. So I'm really thinking about like what do the people who I am in community with, conferring with, what makes them feel safe? And it's not these policies. And I'll have to think more on what policy I would put forward.
Yeah, I specifically became a scholar so I wouldn't ever have to think about what are feasible reforms that we can actually get passed. And so sorry, I'm the last person to ask. I really became a scholar so that I could think big and be a radical and look for root causes. And so from that lens, I would have to say that the number one policy change that could help eliminate the exclusion, expulsion, and precarity of migrants would be border abolition. That as long as we have borders, we will have violence at the borders. There is no such thing as a humane border policy. As long as our migrant exclusion was racist from its inception, it's designed to maintain global inequality that is the result of not just US, but European colonialism. As long as capital continues to flow across borders, people will follow it. And as long as we use the power of state violence to try to stop that, it will always be a catastrophe. And so I think the only policy I could recommend is border abolition. But like Mariam Kaba says of prison abolition, when we talk about abolition, we're not just talking about what we want to get rid of. We're talking about how do we envision a world in which prisons or borders are no longer necessary. And so, yes, abolishing borders is the only ethical policy, but that also entails radically rethinking what type of US financial policy, what type of US military presence, what type of US climate stewardship would be necessary to render borders absolutely unnecessary, and how do we go about building that world?
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Lana, and to all the panelists for their insights there. Okay, so this question, oh, another one just popped up. Okay, so we're coming to the end. We only have time for a few more. This question's for Dr. Taylor, but I think it kind of extends from the previous one, and I'd like others to chime in. It's from Nicole Nelson, and they say, I agree with your point about the lack of enforcement of laws and how we should need another law to increase the Black home ownership rate. Given the present day grassroots movement around criminal justice reform, how can we create a grassroots movement around enforcing fair housing laws to increase the Black home ownership rate? It seems like much of the history of the fair housing movement has faded from public consciousness. And I think, this question is more broadly how can we build vibrant social movements and around many of the issues that we've just raised?
I'll just say, because that, that's a big question, that there are many different ways to kind of look at that. But one of the things I did as a provocation in my book was to end it with an epilogue titled "Against Home Ownership." And really what that is about is not saying that the discrimination against Black people in the housing market is fine and we should be fine with that, but it was to raise a bigger issue, which is, why do we live in a society where people's ability to have things, whether it's healthcare, college education, a dignified retirement, rest on your ability to own a home? And that is what we have accepted with this thing of home ownership, of your own private personal ability to accumulate wealth determined as the determinant of your quality of life. And what I think is that we have to think about, how do we decouple these things? How do we make healthcare a public good? How do we make dignified retirement a public good? Access to education a public good? Safety from financial crisis a public issue, and not your ability to accumulate wealth as the determinant as whether you survive any of those. And, of course, we should absolutely be against and protest against discrimination in the housing market and all of the reasons why Black people continue to be locked out of it. But I think that there are bigger questions at stake. And we also need to examine, what does it mean to constantly raise this wealth gap and say that its solution is for Black people to become private property owners, instead of thinking about the redistribution of wealth, or what it means to send everyone on this journey of debt inheritance, which is what being a homeowner is, as a solution to the wealth gap. And so I think part of what people are trying to get at here is that we can't just use the existing frameworks to think about these questions, let alone to resolve them. That we need to think bigger, and we need to think outside of the existing frameworks to sometimes find solutions. Because one of the things that you figure out very quickly as a historian is that it has been shitty for a really long time. Wow. Why is that? And once you come to that realization, recycling the same frameworks, the same policies, the same solutions over and over again, because they're pragmatic, because they fit within what is available to us politically, gets old. And so, part of this is about thinking about things in a new and different way, which of course shocks and frightens some people. But here we are, in the 21st century, in facing existential crisis after existential crisis. So that's my answer. Sorry.
Great.
Can I jump in very quickly on that?
Please.
Another really important sort of big cultural question we have to answer is, why is there such shame in tenancy, or like the shame in non-home ownership? I mean, I think there's an imagined dignity in being the victim of a police shooting that doesn't exist in being the victim of an eviction. Like we can rally around the imagined innocence of the victim of police violence, whereas the evicted person, I mean, even the messiness of how landlords will throw people's clothes into the street, right? There's something about that that's humiliating in a different type of way than than police violence. And it feels like it's something that's deeply rooted in misogyny, that the dependence of the tenant is something that's shameful. And that needs, and there's also a kind of closetedness about one's property holdings. Like, people will often hide if they are homeowners at all, how much wealth they have. So there's like a queer and gendered lens that has to be applied to the question of homeownership and property and what it symbolizes. And I think the political can't capture any of that, right? So we just have to become cultural studies scholars, maybe, and stop, because as Professor Taylor says, it is a long, ongoing same, right? And then there's all of these almost like libidinal concerns that are not addressed in our scholarship.
Maybe I'll jump in very, very quickly to say, I've been sitting with the question now for nearly an hour about how is public facing work valued at our institutions? How do we do that? And I agreed with the idea. I agree with the idea that, if you write in a popular place or you have a community engaged research partnership, that those things I think are increasingly legible to universities and often celebrated. But what's not usually is the thing that animates it, the sort of concern with, actually creating change. They like the partnership, they like the op-ed, but they don't like the content of the thing. And I think the threat, the threat to good scholarship is that the actual rigorous empirical answer to the question, yes, decommodify the services that are essential for life, like water or housing, abolish the border, stop the suicidal reliance on oil and gas. I could get my employer to throw a massive festival for a means-tested public-private partnership for a rain garden, but good luck getting a little bit of money on like divestment or just can get off of oil, like those, and I live in a place where my employer is sinking rather quickly. So I think the thing that we probably need more validation around, sort of more academic freedom and protection around, is not necessarily the mechanisms of working, beyond traditional academic networks, but respect for the solutions that our work actually suggests, which of course are radical, because if they weren't, then we know they won't work. Because structural problems need structural solutions. That's the only thing that we know. Anyway, that's my answer to the question from an hour ago.
Thank you for that. All right, we have one more question and then we're going to wrap up. I know we could continue this conversation for a long, long time, and it comes from Bench Ansfield. Hi, Bench, thanks for joining us. And they say, thank you all for this fabulous panel. It's clear from all of your presentations that the field is flourishing. My question is about the place where we do our work, the university, and what it means for urban history as a field to be flourishing within institutions that are often playing leading roles in the very things we're writing against: displacement, surveillance, borders, and other forms of violence. Any ideas of how we as a field can grapple with that contradiction? Big question to end on, but we will end there. Thoughts on that? The contradiction that we all, that feeds us, literally.
I can sort of think out loud with this question from a really kind of small example in the scheme of the world, but the organization that I spoke about, CAV Organizing Communities, is also the organization I've been working with to build their organizational archives. And in New York, the Tamiment Library, which is at NYU, is often the archive that holds Asian American left stuff. And for CAV as an organization, which it has sort of become this housing justice organization as well, working with NYU was quite a squeamish kind of thing because of NYU's role as sort of this land holding institution. And so when we were building this archive, it was really kind of important to keep it autonomous, away from institutional support, particularly away from NYU, and then also sort of similarly Columbia. And so I'm thinking with this, because I think as historians, we're thinking about archives a lot, and even the stuff that we collect as historians of the recent past, it's this like it's this self-perpetuating kind of problem of what do you do with the stuff then that you identify if you can't put them into an institution that has the resources to have generators and climate controlled facilities in a climate crisis, just to add. So I don't have answers, but it's definitely something that keeps me up at night.
I mean, this is no shade to bench, but given the climate crisis, there isn't a workplace not implicated in driving forward the the vulnerabilities of people we want to protect, right? So I think we could direct our energies towards reforming our institutions role, or we can direct it towards the state. It almost doesn't matter in a way, right? Because I don't think there's any place from which we wouldn't be implicated in some way. Like I drive my car to work, that's not going to stop, right? So I could also drive my car to the political meeting that might do something. So yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like it's almost, I don't know if it's a question that that's productive.
Well, I would just add two quick things. I mean, one, it comes back to this question of contingency and precarity of academic labor. I think one of the things we have to do is kind of rally as a profession to make sure that people who speak out about specific ways in which universities are engaged in gentrification or displacement, that they are protected from backlash from the powers that be to whatever extent we can do that. I'm thinking about Davarian Baldwin's new work, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, and how he really just kind of lays it all out there of the, exactly what's in that question, the way in which our universities are invested in exactly the types of processes that we're writing against. And then the other thing I would say, just to come back to the promises and possibilities, I'm really inspired by the Cups Off Campus movement and the way that students and faculty and staff at universities are kind of mobilizing to understand the campus as a specific space where they have a right to feel safe, and that the presence of armed police makes so many people feel unsafe, and trying to re-envision what campus safety might look like, and that's also something that we as faculty can amplify.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for that, Lana. And thank you all the panelists for your amazing work, for your time tonight. I think, we just such a sampling of how exciting this field is and how rich it is. And I think all of us are feeling pumped up about future directions. And I think you probably raised a lot more questions I know for me, but I imagine for many of our audience members as well. Thank you all for coming, and please join us for the remaining 3 panelists. This event is part of Urban History Month, which is a project of the Urban History Association. So if you're not a member of the UHA, we hope you'll consider joining today. We'll post a link to our membership page in the chat. We also have, the UHA has many more Urban History Month events coming up, and you can find the full calendar at the link in the chat. And the recording of this event will be uploaded and made available next week.